The night started out perfect. My friend Laura had invited me to her annual Christmas party, a big deal in our circle. Her house was decked out with twinkling lights, the smell of mulled wine and cookies filled the air, and Mariah Carey was on repeat. Everyone was laughing, swapping Secret Santa gifts, and just soaking up the holiday spirit. It was one of those nights where nothing could possibly go wrong. Or so I thought. I had just grabbed a drink from the kitchen when I saw him. A guy standing awkwardly near the tree, nursing a beer. I didn't recognize him at all, and I'd been to enough of these parties to know Laura's regular crew. He wasn't mingling or laughing like everyone else, just kind of observing. It wasn't like he looked dangerous or anything, but something about him just felt off. You know when someone doesn't quite fit the vibe? That was him. After a while, curiosity got the better of me. I nudged Laura, who was halfway through telling a story to a group of people, and asked, "Hey, who's that guy by the tree?" She glanced over, frowned a bit, and said, "I thought you knew him. I figured he was one of your friends." My stomach sank a little. "Nope, never seen him before," I replied. Her frown deepened. We both kept an eye on him after that. Laura eventually decided to ask him who he was. She walked over, her usual bubbly self, and said, "Hey, I don't think we've met. Who invited you?" He just stared at her for a second, then gave this weird, tight-lipped smile and mumbled something like, "Oh, I'm just here with a friend." That's when things got strange. Laura pressed, "What friend?" But he just kind of shrugged, set his beer down, and walked out without another word. At first, we laughed it off. Maybe he'd crashed the party for free drinks or something. It happens, right? But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. Something about the way he left so abruptly, it didn't sit right with me. The party went on, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. Later that night, around midnight, I finally called it a night and headed home. My apartment's only a few blocks from Laura's, so I walked. The air was freezing, my breath fogging up in front of me. I was scrolling through my phone as I turned onto my street, and that's when I saw it, a car parked across from my building. It wasn't unusual for cars to be there, but this one stood out. The engine wasn't running, and the guy inside was sitting in total darkness. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and my heart nearly stopped. It was him. The same guy from the party. He was just sitting there, staring straight at my building. I froze for a second, then ducked into the lobby as quickly as I could without making it obvious I'd seen him. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and peeked through the curtains. The car was still there. I didn't know what to do. Calling the cops felt dramatic. What if I was overreacting? But the longer I stared at that car, the more convinced I became that this wasn't normal. My gut was screaming at me. Finally, I grabbed my phone and called 911. I kept my voice low, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. They told me to stay inside and said an officer would be there soon. It felt like an eternity before I saw the squad car pull up. 2 officers got out and approached the man's car. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but after a few minutes, they opened his door and pulled him out. He didn't resist, just sat there like he was in a daze. One of the officers came to talk to me after. He asked if I knew the man, and I told him about the party. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "We found a notebook in his car. Your name and address are written in it, multiple times." Turns out, he'd been following me for weeks. The cops pieced it together later. He'd shown up at my gym, sat in the back at a coffee shop I go to, even stood outside my office building once. I never noticed him. How could I have been so oblivious? The thought still makes my skin crawl. They charged him with trespassing and stalking, and he ended up spending some time in jail. But honestly, that didn't make me feel much safer. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without double-checking every lock in my apartment. I'd jump at every little noise outside my window. Even now, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder when I walk alone at night. I don't know what his intentions were, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is, that night at the party, something told me he didn't belong. And I'm glad I listened. Office Christmas parties are usually my thing, or at least, they used to be. This year, my co-workers were all hyped about Secret Santa. You know, that thing where you draw a name and buy someone a random gift? It's harmless fun, right? Except, this time, it wasn't. When it came time to exchange gifts, I got a small box with a red bow. Nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw the note taped to the top. It said, "I know where you live, and I'll see you soon." I laughed it off at first. I mean, it had to be a joke. But something about it felt off. That night, when I got home, I noticed the porch light was out. Weird, because I just replaced the bulb a few days ago. As I walked closer to the house, I saw footprints in the snow leading to my backyard. My stomach dropped. I live alone, and I don't exactly get visitors. I stood there for a second, frozen, before rushing inside and locking every door and window I could find. Still holding the note in my hand, I decided to text my coworker, Sam. He's the kind of guy who loves practical jokes, so I figured this was all him. But when I asked, he swore up and down it wasn't. "Dude, that's not funny," he texted back. "You should call someone." The next morning at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every sound, every shadow, it all felt wrong. I casually brought up the note during lunch, trying to see if anyone would confess. Most people laughed it off, but one coworker, Lisa, mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "You remember the janitor? The one who got fired? He used to leave creepy notes for people." The janitor. I hadn't thought about him in months. He got let go for some HR violation, but no one really knew the details. Lisa's comment sent me into a spiral. What if it was him? What if he was back? That night, I was on edge. I triple-checked all the locks and even dragged a chair under the doorknob, just in case. Around midnight, I heard something. It was faint, like footsteps on the porch. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there might hear it. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering into the receiver. By the time the cops arrived, whoever it was had already gone. They found nothing, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. "Probably kids messing around," one of the officers said, but I wasn't convinced. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked my security cameras. I'd installed them last year after someone broke into my neighbor's house. And sure enough, there it was, a man standing on my porch at 11:47 p.m., staring right into the camera. His face was obscured by a hood, but something about his stance felt familiar. I brought the footage to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. "Could be anyone," they said. "We'll keep an eye out." Not exactly comforting. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called Lisa and asked if she knew anything else about the janitor. She hesitated before saying, "I think his name was Paul." I did some digging online and found a few news articles about him. Apparently, Paul had a history of stalking before he got the janitor job. One article even mentioned that he'd been arrested for breaking into someone's home. My hands were shaking as I read it. Over the next few days, things only got worse. I'd hear noises outside at night. Scratching, footsteps, even faint knocking. One time, I found a single red glove on my back porch. I didn't own red gloves. By now, I was barely functioning at work. My boss noticed and pulled me aside, but I couldn't tell him what was going on. How do you explain to someone that you're being stalked by a former janitor who might want to kill you? Then, it all came to a head. I was driving home late one night when I noticed a car following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but every turn I made, they made too. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't just paranoia. I pulled into a gas station, and the car sped off. But when I got home, I found another note. This one was taped to my front door. It said, "You can't hide." That was it. I called the cops again, this time demanding they take me seriously. They stationed a patrol car outside my house for a few nights, and things finally started to calm down. No more notes, no more noises. It was like whoever it was had finally backed off. Weeks later, I got a call from the police. They'd arrested Paul. Apparently, He'd been caught trying to break into another house just a few blocks away. They searched his car and found a stack of notes, gloves, and even a list of addresses. Mine was at the top. I still think about it sometimes, especially during the holidays. I've never participated in Secret Santa again, and I doubt I ever will. Some jokes just aren't funny, you know?